So you want to program heavy singles in your program. Now, managing intensity is clearly important for balancing overload and fatigue. But here's the thing, doing them at the start of the session isn't the only option for powerlifters. We could put singles after the working sets as well. These are referred to as fatigue singles. So the question is, top singles versus fatigue singles, which is better for your situation? Now, if you're new here, my name is Numan Chung and I've spent over 12 years working with lifters, including world championship medalists. In this video, we will go through the definition, the value, and the benefits of doing top singles and fatigue singles. Now, before we dive into the comparison, let's establish why heavy singles matter in the first place. Now, heavy singles offer unique benefits that can't be replicated through just high repetition work alone. When we expose ourselves to heavy singles, we're training to coordinate movement patterns under high absolute loads, and we also replicate the level of maximal force production from a neuromuscular standpoint. Additionally, heavy singles also provide valuable feedback about our current strength levels and help us gauge our readiness for training or competition. Now, the fitness fatigue model would have us believe that heavy singles could cause us acute fatigue. Now, for some people, that might be true, but done at the right level of intensity, it can do the opposite and actually enhance subsequent working set performance. This phenomenon is called potentiation. And that ultimately means that our subsequent working sets can benefit from having done a single before that. Now that we understand why heavy singles are useful, let's get clear on exactly what we're comparing here. So we're talking about two approaches to prescribing heavy singles, top singles and fatigue singles. Now, top singles are heavy single repetitions performed at the beginning of the training session, typically after a thorough warm-up, but before any significant working volume. These singles are performed when you're at your freshest state, allowing you to be able to handle the heaviest possible loads for most cases. Now, fatigue singles, on the other hand, are heavy single repetitions performed after completing some or all of the working sets. These singles are performed in a state of accumulated fatigue, which naturally limits the absolute load that you can handle, but provides a different training benefit. So now that we understand the definitions, let's explore when and why you might choose top singles. There are several compelling reasons to structure your training this way. Now, the first one is potentiation for readiness, as I mentioned before. Now, top singles create a potentiation effect that can enhance your performance of subsequent working sets. Now, when you perform a heavy single at the beginning of your session, you're actually activating your high threshold motor units and priming your nervous system for the work ahead. This neurological activation can lead to improved force production and better movement quality during your back off sets, essentially making your sub-maximal loads feel lighter and actually more manageable. One systematic review from 2021 found that although intensities of 65% of 1 rep max are sufficient to elicit a potentiation effect, higher effects can be achieved with 85 to 90% of 1 rep max intensities. Similarly, they found that experienced athletes will benefit more from a higher volume bout of 1 to 3 sets, as long as 7 to 8 minutes of rest are allowed to avoid fatigue. The next benefit of top singles is dependent back off sets. Now, one of the key advantages of top singles is that they allow your back off sets to be dependent on your actual strength performance that day. Now, rather than going into a session with predetermined percentages, you can use your top single performance to gauge your readiness and adjust your working set loads accordingly. This is particularly useful if you want to capture a specific absolute intensity for those individual sessions. For example, if you want to be targeting 75% of that day, it would be based on your estimated 1 rep max of that day, not a fixed 1 rep max that was determined some time ago. If your singles feels particularly strong, you might increase your working set loads. If it feels heavy or sluggish, you can reduce your load to match your current dipped state. Now, the third benefit is that it optimizes for maximal load performance. Now, top singles specifically train your ability to handle the most load that you can when you're at your freshest state. Now, this directly translates to competition performance, where you need to demonstrate your peak strength. And so by consistently practicing heavy singles in an optimized state, you're reinforcing the movement patterns and neural pathways required for maximal performance when it matters the most. Top singles may not necessarily provide a lot of tonnage, but there is a skill component to coordinating a load that is magnitudes heavier than your own body weight. This is particularly more relevant for the squat and deadlift, where managing your center of mass is key. The fourth benefit is for peak and tapers. Now, during peak and tapering phases leading up to competitions, top singles become particularly useful. They allow you to maintain exposure to competition level intensities so that as a coach and athlete, you are in a better position to come up with an attempt selection plan. Now, from a psychological perspective, it also helps the athlete to get ready with top end load exposure. However, caution should be taken so as to not overshoot where you pass your peak before your competition day. So in a way, yes, because you are in a fresher state, it does allow you to lift heavier loads, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you have to increase the absolute intensity of those heavy singles. The fifth benefit is knowing the consistent state of readiness. Now, top singles provide a consistent testing environment where you can assess your strength levels under similar conditions from session to session and week to week. Now, this consistency makes it easier to track progress and make informed decisions about load selection and training adjustments over time. On the contrary, if you did have a fatigue single instead of a top single, the relative fatigue you experience after working sets that can vary can often change. And ultimately, this makes monitoring week-to-week performance through extracting your E1RMs from your fatigue singles being unreliable. So now let's look at the benefits of fatigue singles. Now let's flip the script and look at why you might want to place your heavy singles after your working sets instead of before. Now fatigue singles offer a completely different set of advantages that might be better suited for certain situations and training goals. The first one would be the conservative exposure to high intensity. Now fatigue singles offer a more conservative approach to high intensity exposure. Because you're performing them in a fatigue state, the absolute loads are going to be naturally lower than what you would handle when you are fresh, reducing the overall stress on the system while still providing exposure to that peak intensity. This can be particularly beneficial during high volume phases or sessions where you want to maintain intensity exposure without adding excessive fatigue. Now the second benefit would be that it could be a load limiting auto-regulation strategy. Now the fatigue accumulated from your working sets acts like a natural load limiter for your singles. Now this built-in safety mechanism helps prevent you from pushing too hard on days when you might be tempted to overshoot. And the fatigue naturally serves as a governor, ensuring that even if you are feeling ambitious, you can't exceed your body's current capacity by too much. The third benefit would be that it minimizes interference to back offset performance. Unlike top singles, which can for some lifters interfere with your planned working sets if they don't go as expected, fatigue singles don't impact your primary volume work. In this scenario, your working sets can be completed as planned and the single serves as additional exposure rather than the determining factor for the rest of the session. Now from my professional experience, some lifters are just simply very sensitive to peak intensity exposure, even when they're conservative, and we shouldn't assume that the potentiation effect applies to every single lifter. And I do think that this assumption can do more harm than good. The fourth benefit is that it can prevent over mentally prioritizing the single performance. Fatigue singles help maintain proper perspective on training priorities. When singles come after your volume work, you're less likely to sacrifice your planned training for the sake of that heavy single. This keeps the focus on consistent quality volume work while still providing strength training benefits as well from that heavy single. Now, from a mental freshness point of view, you are more likely to focus on quality execution on your earlier sets than in your later sets. The fifth benefit is that a fatigue single can help you predict what can be done on a bad day. Now, fatigue singles can provide valuable insight into your strength capabilities when you're not in that peak condition. Now, this information can be useful for competition planning, helping you understand what loads that you can handle even when conditions aren't not necessarily optimal. But here's where it gets interesting. You don't have to choose between performing your heavy single when you are completely fresh or when you're completely fatigued at the end of the session. There is a middle ground that offers some unique benefits as well. So let's explore what happens when you place your single part way through your working sets. And just to clarify what this looks like, it might be that you do 1 or 2 working sets before you work up to that heavy single, and then you have some more subsequent working sets after that as well. So the first benefit would be to maintain relative freshness for the single. By performing your single part way through your working sets rather than at the very end, you maintain some degree of freshness while still having some fatigue from previous work. This middle ground can provide a sweet spot where you're more activated from your earlier sets but not completely exhausted. So there can be a level of top end predictability from that fatigue single. The second benefit would be that it maintains exposure to high intensity stimulus from the previous set. Now, if there is a risk of your single fatiguing you from another high intensity set, by doing a single after the high intensity set, you maintain a level of freshness to perform this multi-rep top set. For example, you might do a heavy triple or a set of 4 before you work up to that single. This is particularly useful if you do not have many subsequent back off sets after the single, so that this high intensity set can still provide a strong stimulus. The fatigue from your previous working set creates a unique training stimulus where you're performing a heavy single under mild fatigue. This can help bridge the gap between fresh performance and heavily fatigue performance, providing a different type of strength training adaptation. The third benefit is that this type of fatigue single can still dictate back offset intensity. Now, mid-set fatigue singles can still be fresh enough to inform your remaining working sets. If your fatigue singles still feel particularly strong or weak, you can adjust the intensity of your remaining sets accordingly, maintaining some of the auto-regulation benefits of top singles. The fourth benefit is that it can help teach lifters to pick load more accurately without overshooting. Now, by doing the fatigue single after an initial top set or 2, you can use this to help teach lifters to pick loads more accurately and not overshoot for their fatigue single. This approach helps develop better load selection skills and consequently the long-term athlete development through a better competence and autonomy in training sessions. Through doing the top set or sets before the fatigue single, lifters can learn to accurately gauge appropriate single loads through watching velocity loss through the reps in the first set. Ultimately, this will develop better intuition for load selection that translate to competition scenarios. Now let's look at the benefits of last set fatigue singles. This is where you are going to be placing your heavy single at the very end of your working sets. While this might seem like the least advantageous position, there are actually some specific scenarios where this approach actually becomes quite useful. The first one is refining technique from working sets. So this would be good for learning or changing technique. When you perform your single after all your working sets, you've had multiple opportunities to practice and refine your technique. Now this makes the last set fatigue singles particularly valuable for lifters who are learning a new movement pattern or making technical adjustments, as they can apply their technique work from their earlier sets to the heavier load. The second benefit would be that some lifters just do not feel the strongest until their later sets. Now individual variations in warm-up requirements and activation patterns mean that some lifters don't reach their peak strength in a session until they've completed several working sets. For these athletes, that last set fatigue single might actually represent their strongest performance of the session despite the accumulated work done in the previous working sets. The third benefit would be that it's a useful strategy for returning to high intensity exposure from injury. Now this is a strategy that I have found useful for lifters returning from specific injuries, namely like muscle strains. When returning from injury, last set fatigue singles can provide a conservative way to introduce high intensity loads. The working set provides a litmus test for maintaining a stimulus without the immediate risk of high intensity exposure. The fatigue from the working sets naturally limits the load that you can handle, reducing the risk of re-aggravation while still providing the beneficial graded intensity exposure. The fourth benefit would be that it's useful for time constrained athletes where working sets double up as warm-up sets. Now for athletes with limited training time, this approach maximizes efficiency by having working sets serve as extended warm-ups for the heavy single. Now this eliminates the need for separate warm-up sets for the single, making the session more time efficient while still providing both volume and top-end intensity exposure. So I hope you guys found that video useful, and as always, click like, subscribe, and I'll see you guys on the next one.